welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Scotland, where we turn once again to the dominating issue of the day. The vaccination programme is now underway, but the new variant coronavirus is rampant, particularly in the south of England, but across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. Today we turn to our panel of key experts to ask them about this race between the vaccine and the virus. Dr. Chris Smith of Cambridge University, the virologist who told us over a year ago in this programme that we faced the greatest public health challenge of our lifetime, we ask him, can we win that race? And then Dr. Barrett Pankani of Exeter University tells us what has to be done now in terms of public health measures to stop the NHS being overwhelmed before the vaccine arrives. But first to Tasmina, with your comments on last week's show.
In response to our show last week featuring Sir Vince Cable and Lord Daffyd Wigley, Tom Platt says, Vince and I are of the same sunny summer vintage. I met him in the mid-1960s before he became famous. We were near neighbours. I've always found it hard to disagree with a few of his views that I have disagreed with. They are so reasonably expressed. Such talents are a tremendous asset to a politician. Ian's not so optimistic about the Liberal Democrats' future electoral success and says, 1 MP for the Lib Dems is their prospect. In response to Lord Wigley's prediction that support for Welsh independence will grow if they can't have a European future within the United Kingdom, Matthew says, didn't Wales vote for Brexit as well? Sure, you could say that if it was Scottish or Northern Irish independence you were talking about, but this is about Wales, which also voted for Brexit. Lord Wigley, of course, went on in his interview to say that he thought Scotland would indeed ditch Westminster rule and he anticipated the reunification of Ireland. To which Bob says, I really hope Boris says he can't do it anymore and he has to drop Scotland and Northern Ireland to look after themselves. And finally, Lorna Sharp says, just like clockwork, the Alex Salmond Show gives us constant in these worrying times. Thank you both, says Lorna. Now, almost a year ago, when President Trump was making fun of the virus, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson wasn't even attending COVID briefing meetings at Downing Street, on the show, Dr. Chris Smith predicted that there was going to be a global pandemic.
What you've potentially got is something which, while it's less lethal than SARS, is much more infectious than SARS and about as lethal as the 1918 flu pandemic, and everyone's susceptible to this, like they were for the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. So if this were allowed to escape and go to its logical conclusion, one possibility, one worst-case scenario, is it could be as bad as 1918.
Today, Alex takes forward that discussion about the race between the vaccine and the virus.
Dr. Chris Smith, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me back, and Happy New Year.
Now, you were one of the first people to identify the scale of the public health challenge that was faced with this virus almost a year ago on this show. Now, in this year of 2021, are we sure that the vaccine cavalry is going to come over the hill, or are there still dangers to come?
I think there are still some twists, turns and handbrake turns on the part of coronavirus yet to play out. But we have our best fighting chance now of seeing the back of this thing in 2021 because we're attacking it on multiple fronts now. We've got public health measures that we know work, but they're extremely costly in many ways. But we do have treatments, we do have drugs that have been proven to make a very substantial difference to people with severe disease. And now the real cavalry riding to our rescue are these vaccines. And not 1, not 2, but 3 have come along all at once, rather predictably like London buses. But that's really great because what it means is that we can unbottleneck supply chains, and we also have a range of different options. Not all vaccines are going to be suitable for all people and all geographies, and this is a world problem. So these vaccines have got to work in all territories. The fact that we now have 3 of them approved and they're going into lots of people at million scale with an ambitious plan to get them into millions more very quickly. This is brilliant news.
Now, Dr. Smith, when we last spoke in this show just before Christmas, the UK death toll had just passed 60,000. Now it's 80,000 and rising. Why has the virus been so resurgent over the last month? Is it because of the new variant, because of non-compliance, or are the public health measures not been strong enough?
Across Europe, the World Health Organization has pointed to the fact that many countries, more than half, are struggling with severe resurgences of coronavirus. Now that points to the fact that it's not just new variants that are causing this to happen, because the new variant is largely, but not exclusively, confined to the UK at the moment. And although it has been exported overseas and almost certainly will gain traction there, it therefore can't account for the big surges in cases that we're seeing in other countries. Germany, for example, held up often as a paragon of pandemic preparedness and control, have suffered similar rates of mortality that we're seeing here in the UK at the moment. So what is accounting for it? Well, a range of factors. Ahead of Christmas, Jonathan Van Tam, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer in England, said that we face a headwind with winter, and is absolutely right, because the vast majority of infectious diseases do spread much better in the wintertime, and it speaks for itself. It's pretty obvious why. When it's freezing cold, we keep the doors closed, we keep the windows closed, and we seek enjoyment, entertainment and company inside, not outside. And these infectious diseases prey on the fact that we do that. It has been Christmas and there has been more festivity and more gatherings going on, although in a limited way, and I think that may have played a part. But equally, I think there's a degree of lockdown fatigue and leakiness on the part of lockdowns and other control measures. We had a very profound lockdown when all this began in March and April of 2020. People were very compliant and it was unequivocal what the rules were, and people went along with them. Then things eased up when levels of the virus disappeared and dropped down in July. And as a result of that, I think people got used to being a bit more normal again. And so when those freedoms were snatched away again in the autumn, but they weren't snatched away all at once, it took a while for people to really appreciate the gravity of the situation. And as a result, while they were paying lip service to some of the rules, I don't think the compliance was really there in the same way. I think these sobering numbers that we're now seeing, with 50% more people in hospital at the moment as we speak than at the peak of the March-April first wave of the virus, a death toll beyond 80,000, as you quite rightly point to, just in the UK. These sorts of numbers are focusing minds, and I think people are realising that we face a serious challenge at the moment.
Now, the new variants we know are more infectious. Why don't we know if they are more or less deadly, given the number of people who've been infected thus far? Why isn't there a clear answer to that question?
For the moment, we don't think that the new variants are more deadly, because what we haven't seen is a big rise in the case fatality rate. In other words, you can monitor how many people are catching the virus and how many people are dying of it. And you can calculate, therefore, what the mortality rate attached to that infection is. If the new variant were contributing to a big surge in cases, which we think it is, and if it were more lethal than we thought it was before, then we should see that reflected in an increase in the fatality rate. That we haven't seen. We're just seeing an increase in numbers because more people are catching the virus, and that's translating into more severe cases and ultimately more mortalities. And also, even more critically, they don't appear to be making the virus able to sidestep the protection conferred by the current generation of vaccines that we're putting into patients.
Now, Dr. Smith, many people watching this programme will be eagerly awaiting their vaccination. If you're vaccinated and protected, do we know if you're still infectious to other people? And if you had COVID when you're being vaccinated, did this change the protection that the vaccine offers?
Well, let's answer the first bit of that after the second question you asked, which is, well, what happens if I've got COVID right now and I go and get vaccinated? Now, there are circumstances when we sometimes use vaccines to prevent people getting an infection, because in the case of an infection with a very long incubation period, sometimes the vaccine can give your immune system a head start and you never then develop the clinical syndrome. That's not the case with this new coronavirus. The vaccines don't confer protection soon enough to ward off infection. So there will inevitably be people turning up for vaccination who have caught this thing, and they could be incubating it at that time. This is not a worry, it's not a concern, and it won't do people any harm. It might not actually help them to fight off the infection, but it certainly won't do any harm. There will also be people who have in the past had coronavirus and they're getting vaccinated again. Will that cause a problem? Again, we don't think that's a problem, because if you have fought off coronavirus in the past, then you have some immunity, and this vaccination, this immunisation, will effectively behave a bit like a booster. It will remind your immune system what it's learned to fight off, and it will consolidate it. It will strengthen that immune response. So again, we don't think that that is a major challenge for people who actually are encountering the infection. And the really critical element as to whether or not a person who has been vaccinated and can catch the infection or not, we don't know the answer to this yet. The trials that have been done have assessed whether a person, when they're vaccinated, is protected from COVID. COVID is the disease caused by coronavirus. They haven't appraised thoroughly yet whether it can prevent you still catching coronavirus infection. Now, the reason for this subtle difference and this nuance is that in studies that were done during the development of at least one of the vaccines on monkeys, they found that the animals were prevented from getting severe disease if they were vaccinated, but they could nevertheless still catch the infection. If you can catch the infection, albeit in a mild way, without even having any symptoms, you could still be shedding the infection, in other words, spreading the infection. So this is an open question at the moment. Scientists are actively pursuing this to find out the answer, and only time is going to tell because we don't have a time machine or a crystal ball yet. But we will find out very quickly, especially given the scale of the infection running through the population at the moment and the scale at which vaccination is progressing across the UK.
Does that mean that lockdown restrictions of some kind will have to stay in place until everyone is protected, till everyone has been vaccinated?
Well, if you think about the situation we were in last summer in 2020, we got the level of circulating virus down to a very low level, which enabled us to relax many of the measures that were holding it in check. At the moment, the measures that have been put in place aren't to stop people catching the virus so much as to protect an overwhelming surge in demand for health services. At the moment, we have 50% to 100% more people seeking healthcare because of coronavirus than we did back in March and April of 2020. Allowed to continue unchecked, we would very quickly start to see more people succumbing from more other conditions that we couldn't treat because we didn't have the resources available. So at the moment, the vaccine rollout is all about targeting people who, if they catch coronavirus, they are going to develop severe disease sufficiently bad to potentially lead to their loss of life. So we're trying to cut mortality by vaccinating those priority groups, as well as those people who work for the health service or provide care for those vulnerable individuals. We need to protect those as well to keep the services running. But once we're beyond that, we should also begin to see levels of the virus lower and drop, A, because there's been a lockdown, but B, because the weather is going to improve. Spring will come. There will be more vaccinated individuals in society, which will make it harder for the virus to spread, and therefore I anticipate there will be some easing of measures. And then as we progress with the vaccination programme, we'll drive down the level of circulation of the virus, going hand in hand with better weather in the summer. So we'll be back to the position we were in last year, but hopefully we won't then see an autumn resurgence like we did last year and then have to lock the country down again.
Join us after the break, where Alex will continue his discussion with Dr. Smith, and we'll also be joined by Dr. Bharat Pankhania. See you then. Welcome back. Alex now continues his discussion with Dr. Chris Smith, managing editor of the Naked Scientist blog.
Dr. Chris Smith, you once told me that you envisaged that coronavirus would move from being a pandemic to being endemic. Is it a case of this virus in some way, in some variant, is going to be with the human population for a long time to come?
The current consensus medically is that that is absolutely the case. We think that this new coronavirus is going to join the ranks of the existing 4 other human common coronaviruses that circulated, have been with us for hundreds to thousands of years. They come every winter time and they cause coughs and colds in a handful of people. They account for a few % of the seasonal infections that we get every winter. This new one, we anticipate, because it's so infectious, because it's so well adapted to people, it will continue to spread almost certainly, and at least for an appreciable period of time. The good news is, of course, that while it will behave a bit like the flu and keep coming back, we have at least now got vaccines that we can also update fairly easily and in a fairly agile way like we can with the flu. And since we already have a template for mass vaccination seasonally for things like the flu, it should be relatively easy going forward once we understand how long the immunity conferred by the vaccines is, and also what the likelihood of the virus being able to mutate and change in such a way that might require updating of the vaccine. We'll be able to feather the coronavirus vaccination programme in alongside the flu vaccination programme, because really the people who need a flu jab every year are the same people who are at risk if they catch coronavirus. And so therefore we could actually use and piggyback on one system on the other to achieve an efficient and fairly streamlined service.
Now, the English Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, says he's working on a timetable to vaccinate every adult by the autumn, and the other countries of the UK are on a similar schedule, as indeed are other countries around the world. But the State of Israel plans to vaccinate their adult population by this spring, under criticism for not vaccinating the West Bank, but they're on a much sharper timescale. How come is it one country can get a much quicker vaccination programme and other countries can't?
I gather from speaking to colleagues at the JCVI, that's the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, that in fact the bottleneck isn't that we're unwilling, it isn't that we don't have enough pairs of hands laid on the pumps, it's that the bottleneck is in supplies of the vaccine at the moment. Now, inevitably that's going to change because we have not one, not two, but 3 vaccines on tap now that have been approved by regulators, and so hopefully that bottleneck will be eased, and in the meantime there's a big scale up going on to get more people through training and prepared ready to run mass vaccination once that bottleneck eases. So I gather that the problem isn't so much one of unwillingness, but of a lack of supply of vaccines at the moment.
The English programme of vaccination seems to be concentrating on some super centres to vaccinate, while other countries in the UK seem to be having a much more locally based vaccination programme. Have you any feel, in terms of your own experience in these matters, as to what's best, or is it a matter of horses for courses?
To a certain extent, hitherto, it's been down to what works for the vaccine. We've been unfortunately enthralled to the fragility of the vaccine rather than the vaccine being our slave. And the reason for this is that the Pfizer vaccine that was approved first and began to be rolled out is particularly brittle and fragile as vaccines go. It has to be kept at a very low temperature until just before you need it. It comes in a certain number of doses and in a batch, and you have to use all of those at once because, as Jonathan Van Tam, Deputy Chief Medical Officer, said, you can't treat this like a yoghurt and just get some out of the fridge, use a bit, put it back. So for that reason, there were logistical headaches around distribution. There aren't many care homes, for example, with 975 people that you can just line up and vaccinate. The good news is that with the approval of the AstraZeneca vaccine, this is much more robust and is capable of being treated a bit more like one of Jonathan Van Tam's yogurts. And in that respect, it makes it much easier to deliver this to places like care homes, to people who are housebound, and smaller settings like primary care and so on and so forth. That will be aided and improved enormously by the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Dr. Chris Smith of Cambridge University, thank you once again for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Bharat Pankhania of Exeter University is one of the leading lights speaking out in this public health emergency. Alex asked him what the public can do to maximise their safety at this really difficult and stressful time.
Dr. Pankhania, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Now, we're in this position where the virus is resurgent. Are there additional public health measures which would help meet this crisis situation?
Well, what we should do is do what we were supposed to do in the first instance. And if you look at what the Far Eastern countries have achieved by just the 3 C's, you would get very far. The 3 C's are: avoid getting close to other people, avoid crowded places, especially indoors, and avoid closed indoor places with poor ventilation. So if you follow those 3 C's, and for example, you wear your mask and you wear it properly, and you continue to do all those infection control measures, we would be in a better place.
Dr. Pankhania, why is the virus so resurgent? Is it non-compliance? Is it the new variant? Or were the public health measures not tough enough in the first place?
So it is a combination of all of those factors, and it is disingenuous of our leaders to say it's all because of the new variant that is more infectious. Even if it were more infectious, we've got to realize that until you get infected, the virus is just there, be it the original version or the new version. So what we have not been doing properly, and we just are reluctant to do it, which is restrict and reduce our interactions with fellow human beings, because this is a human-to-human spread of infection. Secondly, our infection control measures are half-hearted. What do I mean by that? We wear a mask, but invariably we don't wear it properly. We enter into crowded places knowing full well that it's not safe to enter poorly ventilated, crowded indoor places like supermarkets, like shops. And then we go on to public transport, not wearing masks properly and or ventilating that bus or train properly. And all of those things put together give you a rise in number of cases, especially when you've got a new variant, which is releasing lots and lots and lots of virus particles so that it is easier to get infected by it.
But are the UK figures, the 4 countries of the United Kingdom, are they much worse than international examples? Or isn't it the case that just about everyone is struggling to contain this virus?
Well, unfortunately, if we compare like for like with our European counterparts, similar countries, similar population, similar age structures, then unfortunately, the UK numbers are very high. And they're very high because leading up to Christmas period, December onwards, we had all that traditional thing that we do, which is go around buying presents, go around interacting on buses, trains, shops, shopping centers, etc. So the seeding took place there. And here in January, we are paying the price for it.
So are you saying that the heavy death toll we're seeing now, over 80,000 deaths in the countries of the United Kingdom, is a direct result of the easing of the lockdown before Christmas?
Unfortunately, it has a bearing on it. Of course, unfortunately, it's so sad because on the one hand, we've got a variant from which it is easy to get infected by. So it generates more cases. More cases equals more people will end up in hospital, equals more people will end up in ITU, equals more people will die. So it isn't a case of this variant is more severe disease causing. It is more a case of it is easy to get infected by it because our infection control measures are not good enough. And number 2, this new variant enables the infected, infectious person to release a lot more viruses from their nose, mouth secretions, which people then pick up and get infected by.
Now, last summer, the great hope was that test and trace would contain the virus. What has gone wrong with the test and trace systems in the countries of the United Kingdom?
So we never set it up properly, especially in England. I know Wales did a much better job. Test and trace only works when case numbers are low. But when you have case numbers in excess of 1,000 per 100,000 people, then the contact tracing and especially centralized contact tracing will fail. It's not possible to contact trace a large number of contacts of a large number of cases. Just not possible. And it would have been better if we had done localized contact tracing, because then we would have kept the case numbers down and we would continue like the South Koreans, like the Far Eastern countries have achieved. We could have done it. We took a wrong turn very early on.
Looking at the hopes for the vaccine rollout, the UK government are now saying that by the autumn, all adults will have had their vaccination. But in Israel, they're saying this is going to be done by the spring. Is there anything that can be done and lessons can be learned in order to get that vaccine into more arms more quickly?
Somebody like myself have been advocating for a long time we should have a 24/7 operation and we should immunize as fast as possible, as many as possible, as safely as possible, and you can make that a 24/7 operation. Now, here is the nub of the problem, why we can't do it. our leaders are not saying it explicitly, but the issue is we need a large enough supply of vaccines on a daily basis. It's good enough to say to us, I have got 100 million doses, but those 100 million doses don't translate into, I have got hundreds of thousands of bottles with the vaccine in it ready to be injected into people's arms. That's not the case. So if we haven't got a supply, then we can't do the 24/7 operation. I would go one step further, and I would say this: no one is well unless everyone is well. I would say, look, set up under license, under royalties, a manufacturing plant to make extra vaccines. And my reasons are, even if we don't use it, we can give it to other countries. And if they use it, they get better, we feel better, we will also remain better. Because until everyone is immunized, we will continue to get sporadic outbreaks.
From all your public health experience, for the people watching this programme, what are the key things they should be doing to protect themselves and their families?
So in the midst of very high case numbers, there's only one simple advice: keep away from other human beings. This is very important. And especially if you are in the older age group, vulnerable group, just keep away from other humans. Get somebody else to do your shopping for you, etc. Keep away from other human beings. That's the best advice I can give.
Dr. Bharat Pankhania of Exeter University, thank you so much for joining me on the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Just when we all hoped that the end was in sight, the virus has roared back with deadly impact. Nowhere is this more true than the 4 administrations of the UK, where the health service is closer to being overwhelmed than at any stage throughout this crisis. The disaster in the care homes, the summer holiday relaxation, Eat Out to Help Out, pubs open, the student halls of residence super spreaders, the test and trace failure, the Christmas folly, the slow realisation of the threat of the new variant virus. They represent a litany of failures. Of course, many countries are struggling, but the United Kingdom is struggling more than most. With mortality and infections now at record levels, the vaccination cavalry cannot arrive quickly enough. The UK was among the first of countries to licence the vital vaccines, but they and other countries have been left standing by the vaccination programme in Israel, where every adult is due to be protected by the spring. In other countries, it will be lucky to be this autumn. And therefore, frightened populations have the right to ask, why is it that some countries, like New Zealand and Vietnam, can show how to control the virus in public health terms? And again, why is it a country like Israel is so far ahead in the vaccination programme? This is a question which requires to be answered. But from now on, Tasmina and myself and all at the show, it's goodbye for now. Stay safe, and we'll see you again next week.